We've got John Park with us today. John Park is the manager of the Heritage Museum at Bullcreek. A quick background on John. He was born in California, so that makes him an American. He is a trained electronics engineer and worked in the aircraft industry and with Lockheed Martin. He came to Australia and set up his own business, and he learned to fly and got a private pilot licence. He became a volunteer at the museum and eventually became its manager.
What I'm going to talk about first today is the actual history of the Aviation Heritage Museum. It's based on a book that was written, well, it was actually started by Frank Purser. Frank was, and I'll talk about him in a minute, but he basically was the first curator and really the reason the museum exists. You've probably seen this. This is our Mark 16 model Spitfire made by the Kiwis. That's outside the museum. It's basically a large model, and but it's of course our iconic aircraft of our association. Then been there on the pedestal since 1985, and of course before that the actual Mark 22 Spitfire was there, which has now been restored and is inside the museum. The museum really dates back to 1929. The association was started by a few gentlemen, as you see there. It's one of the first meetings back in 1929, and it was actually held at the Midland RSL Club. They were all RSL members, and one of the members had just moved here from over east, and he had been a member of an association, new association, that was called the Australian Air Corps Association. And so he basically talked them into forming their own division, the West Australian division of the Air Force Association. And we don't really have a lot of information, unfortunately, about why they actually decided to get together. But the interesting thing is that the very first thing that they did was restore an aircraft. There was an aircraft that was available called the Kalgoorlie biplane. If you're not familiar with the Kalgoorlie biplane, it was built in Kalgoorlie by, well, a bunch of miners, basically. Most of them had never even seen an airplane, no less flown in one. And for some reason, they decided about 1912 to order some plans from England of a generic aircraft and a biplane and build it as you would. And so they got the plans, which, by the way, we actually have the originals, which is nice. It's actually in the museum. And they started to build this aircraft in the City Hall. The City Hall of Kalgoorlie was the only place that was available. It was large enough, and they started building. And of course, they also used the local mine workshops to build things for the aircraft. And they proceeded to build, again, this aircraft that, again, most have never even seen an aircraft fly. They did finish it in 1915, and they flew it. But not very well. It wasn't the pilot's fault, it was actually the engine's fault. You see, in 1915, when they finally were able to get an engine, they were not able to get a new engine because the war had started. The war was starting in Europe, and basically all your aircraft engines were, well, military items. And so they were only able to get a gnome engine from get this, the Bristol box kite, a used engine that was missing one piston and another one was broken. So they repaired the piston in the workshops, forged up a new piston, got the engine running. It's all good, right? Well, the problem was about every time they took the airplane up, the engine would seize up on them. So it was basically take off, fly for a bit, crash land. And this gets a bit old after a while, as you can imagine. And I think the actual end of the story was that they landed the plane once, crash landed the plane once on a road. They went to they'd actually damaged one of the wheels on landing. So they repaired the wheel in the bush there outside of Boulder. They then tried to take off again. Unfortunately, the wheel collapsed on takeoff, as you would. And of course, the plane decided to do a 180-degree flip and land on its back. They then sent somebody into town, got a horse and cart. We're gonna, gotta get this thing back to get it fixed. And they put it on the cart, and the horse got spooked. And we started running off into the bush with this aircraft on the back, and of course with them in tow, trying to stop the horse from running. And of course they got more damaged as that happened. They did manage, of course, to recover it and take it back to Kalgoorlie, and they did repair it, and they did fly it again, believe it or not. More guts I know than me. Anyway, so they, but that was pretty much the end of the story. They decided about that time, somebody's going to die, okay? And so it's time to give it away. And so they just basically parked it there in Kalgoorlie, and again in 1929 they found it was available, and they thought, the association that is, and they said, well, this is great. We can get the Kalgoorlie biplane, we'll restore it, we'll drag it down the street, because in November, now the association started in May, in November of the same year was the 100th anniversary of Perth parade. And so that's great. We can tell everybody about our association. We'll put a sign on the side of the plane. We'll push it down we're going to push it down the street. And if you've ever seen the pictures of St. George Terrace and Adelaide, St. George and Adelaide Terrace in those days, it wasn't 4 lanes like it is now. It was only 2 lanes. It was a narrow street. And so the police said, no, I think that's not going to work. It's going to be too dangerous. People are going to get hit the wings and such as you're pushing it down. So they said, oh, that's not good. And so they said, well, what we'll do is we'll put it on the back of a truck. Oh. And so that's what they did. They took the wings off, put it on the back of the truck, folded the wings back so it's still there, and basically drove it down the street on the back of this truck. The same with signs, AFA and all that on the side. And it was a goal, and they did what they wanted to do. And you can see the markings. They painted it with in a sort of a World War I camouflage marquee is a word. That's because, of course, they were all World War I pilots. You can see the wings folded back, and this actually was restored by one of our volunteers. He went through, and it was a bit hard to actually see the aircraft in the original photograph, but there you go. Now, the association said, well, what are we going to do with the plane now? We got this plane, we have no place to put it, we have no money, we have got a few members, what are we going to do with it? Well, they did what they thought would be the best thing, which would be to donate it to the WA Museum. WA Museum, of course, it was early days for them. They had a lot of artifacts, mostly dresses and things from the beginnings 100 years earlier, but they really weren't into airplanes, and pretty much still aren't. And so they didn't know what to do with it, so they just put it in the shed out back. And that was fine for a few months, but then the next year in 1930, they decided to redo the whale, if you know the big whale skeleton, so they decided to redo that, so they were going to need to bring it back into the storage, and so the airplane had to go. So what they do, they put it out back of the museum in the alleyway. The gardener burnt some of it as rubbish. The main fuselage and engine and such were still there. A local person, what we think might have been one of our members, but we're not sure, actually recovered the fuselage and engine and took it home. And the idea was for him to restore it. It sat in the backyard for many years until the war started. And then he went off to war, and during the war, his father decided to fix the fence. So he took the wood, tore the wood off the aircraft, and actually replaced his fence. And of course, termites did the rest. The engine was lost, and we still have 1 piston from the engine in the museum. We have 2 wheels, and the plans, and one of the props, and of course the other prop is here at the Royal Air Club. There was actually 4 props made, so we're still looking for the others. If you run across one of the other, we think there's probably at least 1 more out there, probably not both of them. If you find it, let us know. The association continued, of course, during the war. They set up a kitchen and a recreation area for RAAF and other flyers in Perth. After the war, they purchased this house on Adelaide Terrace, and basically set it up as the AFA Memorial House. You can see them, and this is installing the Spitfire in 1959. In the front, they purchased the Spitfire from England. There's a lot of stories about this. The stand was made by Vickers Aircraft, specifically for the aircraft. It is still the same stand we are using today out front of the museum. We had a big refurbishment of the Spitfire here just a couple years ago, and I had a local company that does non-destructive testing, aircraft testing, come through and actually have a look at the stand. They did a visual inspection, and after that they came in and they said, when did you say that stand was made? I said, 1959. No, it wasn't. I said, well, yeah, it was. No, it wasn't. I said, what do you mean it wasn't? Well, they said the welding on it is too modern, the quality on it is too modern. That the machinery you need to do that just wasn't around in your typical workshop in 1959. It just wasn't available. And they said, the next question was, they asked, well, who made it? And I said, Vickers Aircraft. There you go. And I said, do I really need to, do you want to do, x-rays and et cetera, et cetera? They said, no, it's in good shape. It's not going to cause you any problems. It's going to be around for a lot longer, a lot more decades. So there you go. The stand actually, as you notice, actually turns the aircraft a bit to starboard, and also points it a little bit down. And that, of course, is to keep wind loading from actually buffeting the aircraft and making it, it lasts long. It's one of the reasons that it has lasted as long as it has. It's very specific about that angle. Now, we had a large membership of the association, no money, but we had Frank Purser. Yes, this Frank Purser was an absolute gem when it came to our association. He was our first general secretary, which you could say was like CEO, president, and all wrapped into one. And his dream was to have a museum. And people used to bring items to the association that they had souvenired during the war, and he would collect as many as he could. And when the museum was finally built, we had stuff spread out all over Perth. As far south as Bunbury, all the way out to York and so on. People had stuff stored in their garages and their chicken sheds, and then everywhere. It was just a huge amount of stuff. People would come in and say, I want to donate this, and he'd say, oh, that's great, can you take it home and keep it for us? Because they didn't have any room for it in this small house there. He was also the first paid employee, and again, the first curator of the museum. Now, Frank worked diligently to get the museum from when he started till the museum was built in 1979. He looked at all different places. We actually looked at Maylands, at Jandakot. In fact, he even came out here one time, and they were so sure they were going to be able to build a museum out here that he staked out some property, but that all fell through. And in 1979, it looked pretty bleak for a museum. We had all this stuff all over the place, but no place to put it. And the government wouldn't come to the table, so it was very, very bleak time. Lancaster had arrived in 1962. This was sitting out of Perth Airport, as you know. This is it in its French maritime colors. It was basically a maritime aircraft from Noumea. There was 3 of them down there. One is now back in England. That's the one that they run up and down in Lincolnshire, up and down the runway. And then there is the other ones in New Zealand. Basically, this was our association saw this at Darwin when it was flying through, and Frank Purser thought, oh, that's great. I'll send a letter to the French and see if they're done with that aircraft. So Frank sent them a letter. They said, if you're done with that thing, that airplane, we'll take it. They wrote back a letter and said no. A couple weeks later, they got another letter from the French back, and because they had thought, well, this is the end of it. They said, no, that's it. And they said, oh, well, we have to change our mind. We're going to take the aircraft to Sydney. We're going to take the engines off. We're going to take everything out of what we want. You can have what's left. And Frank, no, that's not what we want. We're going to build a museum. You wrote back a letter saying, well, thanks, but no thanks. Can't really do much with that. Well, a couple weeks later, you got another letter back. And they said, oh, well, we've changed our mind again, and we're going to fly it to Perth. You can have it if you pay for the fuel and get our guys back to Noumea. So they did. They flew to Sydney. The association members there took care of the crew overnight, took them out to dinner, got them a place to stay. Flew to Adelaide the next day, same difference. The association in Adelaide took care of the pilot and the crew. put them up for the night, give them a meal, and then they flew it into Perth on December 1st, 1962. Now, that was actually quite an interesting date because it was actually the closing ceremony of the Commonwealth Games. And so they decided to do a couple, laps around the games, all exciting for the people at the venue. And there was a few pilots that went up from here in Jandakot and actually met the plane and basically escorted it into Perth Airport. Landed at Perth Airport, stopped the plane, engine stopped. Everybody's waiting for the pilots to get out, and the pilots and the crew. Nobody gets out. They're waiting. Half an hour later, the doors open and they come out in their nice white uniforms. They had to change their clothes. I mean, they're French after all, but they look good. And so they changed into their whites because they knew the press was out there to take pictures. And basically went around trying to hand the keys to whoever would take it because they didn't know who would talk to, because obviously they just come from Namibia. So they didn't know who it was. And so anybody that looked official, they went up to, no, you give them to him. And they finally got the keys to the right person, and which I assumed would be Frank Purser. So there you go. And you can see there's no fence. There's nothing, just kind of put a little rope around it. Eventually there was a fence, and eventually members used to go out and let the public in on weekends. And eventually a lot of it was damaged because it did sit there for almost 20 years, from 1962 to 1979. In 1970, again, we bought a property over there in Bullcreek. This is them putting up the Spitfire for the first time. That would be the Mark 22, of course. And they were, and you can see it's pretty desolate. We were actually one of the Spitfire came up as soon as the club was finished. You can see the club there in the background. And you can also notice that there is no houses. A couple of the houses, I think they built 6 houses after that before they eventually did decide to put the museum on the Bullcreek property. This is it in 1979 with the Lancaster there on the left. This is, basically, as you can see here, it was very early days for the museum. There was quite a crowd, 100 people. So it was only open, they only had 40 volunteers. And so it was very hard to keep the museum open. They struggled a lot. The association, remember, at this time had almost no money. And they were basically living from, one house to the next, as it were. They would build some houses, borrow some money, build some houses, sell those houses, and then pay back the loans and have, a few dollars left, but not much. And so in those days, the volunteers used to actually, they would bend nails that they took out of displays, straighten them again so they could reuse them. It was that bad. They really had no money. And also, any money they did make, because the association was dead poor, would go to the association, not back into the museum. So it was really hard, and it was a tough time for them. It was the only reason they were able to actually get the building at all was that it was the 150th anniversary of Perth. Yay for the anniversary of Perth. Because there was a fund called the Way 79 Fund, an industry fund that was set up by the government to basically funnel money to projects to celebrate this 150th anniversary. And we were able to actually build the building there for about $120,000. This shows the building property. Again, you see we've got the south wing and the north wing, and not much in between. A few of the houses have finally gone up by this time. This was taken about 1984, 85. This was a typical display back in those days. The floors, unfortunately, one of the issues is in those days when they built buildings, they didn't bother putting plastic under the foundations, or at least it wasn't a requirement. So consequently, every time they would paint the floor, the water would come up seep up through the floor, and the paint would start to bubble and break. And then they made the mistake of actually painting the floor different colors. So then you had different color flaking paint. It looked terrible, grays and greens and so on. And again, they had a lot of stuff, but it was just, there was really no way of actually storing it. When they had that first building in the front, there was no storage. And so the little office they built for the manager just kept filling up with stuff because it was the only place to put things. And they still had not enough room to either store or display everything that they had in their collection that was scattered all around Perth. And so it got pretty crowded. in the museum. This is one of the displays of Moth miner, actually at Burswood. One of our volunteers, by the name of Alan Buzza, you might know Alan. It's out of Serpentine. He restored this, and along with some of the other volunteers, he took this plane actually home and restored it at home. And again, they did not have room at the association or any place to do it, so he took it home and did it there. And now he's actually in the process of restoring it again. So it's all good. This was the North Wing. It opened in 1984. It was basically an extension. It was actually paid for by the association. The association had a bit of money by then, and we also got some other money from the government. But mostly it was our back. The building is rather strange. You see, it's just kind of a round curve. It actually starts off as a flat roof on the ground, and then they pinned one side of it and pushed it into an arc, like you see there. So both this end here and the end in front was open, and that's how they were able to actually get the large aircraft in, like the Lancaster and the Dakota and all the other. They actually rolled them in through those openings, and then built the walls after. This is the Lancaster, about 1986 or so, 87 maybe. You can see the displays again are still pretty rudimentary. It's very crowded, and during its restoration time. Luckily, we had some good volunteers who were able to work on these aircraft. They actually traveled to England on holiday with their wives to get parts, and spent their holidays running around England trying to find this gauge or that part for it. And so it was to the point where it is actually now the most restored Lancaster in the world. There are some that fly, but those have been mostly stripped bare inside because you got weight problems, right? If you're going to fly an aircraft, you want it as light as possible, you strip out everything and you can. The ones that are in museums around the world have typically been stripped out or empty shells, and usually we strip them because when you transport them, you don't want to, again, you want to reduce weight. And so this one is pretty much, well, all there. It's got the original wiring. Obviously it's degraded quite a bit. All the original plumbing is there, a lot of the original bits. It is not a perfect World War II aircraft, obviously, because it did belong to the French. They did some modifications, such as upgrading the radar, putting a window in the side. Well, you got to see the girls on the beach, right? And so yeah, a few little modifications, but generally speaking, it is, again, the most restored Lancaster in the world. This was Al Clark. You might have known Al. Al, of course, was a major player, and was actually was the manager for the longest time. He was the curator of the museum for 12 years, from back in the 90s and early 2000s. He was did a huge effort, and basically he brought the museum more into a museum age, you might say, with museum best practice, making sure we keep track of things, increase. Money was a big thing with him, and he actually made it so that the money that the museum was making was plowed back into the museum, and so, which it is now. And so he set up our accounting systems and other things. But basically was a huge player, and he still comes out and visits. He's actually still a volunteer at the museum. Comes out and does a bit of guiding once in a while. This was the third demountable being delivered. And again, some of the artifacts brought into the museum. The museum needed more room for storage, so we got 3 demountables to add to the 2 buildings, and basically they're now our libraries. We have over 10,000 books on aircraft, a lot of very unique, one-of-a-kind items that you won't find anywhere else, log books, a lot of good information. If you're interested in writing articles or magazines or books or whatever, we can provide a lot of photographs, hundreds of thousands of photographs, again, all about airplanes with us. Unfortunately, our demountables are starting to reach their end of life, and we are going to need to do something else in the not too distant future. So this was the arrival of the Mark 16 Spitfire in 1985, and you can see on the stand there, which we still have, and whenever we need to move the Spitfire around, we can actually put it on a wheel stand, and getting ready to be installed to replace the Mark 22. There's Al again, and Alan Buzza, basically recovering the Wacket from Broome. Horry Miller's Wacket was up there and was basically languishing and falling apart, and basically just being ignored mostly. It needed a lot of help. Notice the flat tire on the side there next to Al. So they went up and recovered it, brought it back down to our museum, and spent about the next 6 years restoring the aircraft. And if you ever come to the museum, you'll see that it's an absolutely beautiful thing, and there it is there. This is the type of work they do. So an absolutely beautiful aircraft, restored, brand new glory, as it were. We do that with some aircraft and some items. We'll restore them to brand new. Others we leave as they are. It depends on the article and the artifact and what's involved. Not all restorations were a success. We had some like this one, the heron, and the heron was a lot of people wanted to restore the heron. It was used here in WA. When I arrived, that's basically what it looked like. That was in 2008 when I first came to the museum. And the problem with it was, A, we did not have the room to display it anywhere, and B, it was just degrading and we needed to lose it. It is over now in Moorabbin. You might remember the Junkers. The Junkers, this was a replica built for the program they did about it. And of course it also had to go over east because we needed room for the Catalina. And so it was moved out and it went to Bankstown, which unfortunately now is closed, and they're looking at moving possibly to Camden. We're not sure. The arrival of the Catalina was a huge thing for the museum, and of course it came from America, from Houston, Texas, and it was the Catalina Foundation, paid for by the WA government really through the WA Museum. So the WA Museum now manages it, even though we have it on a long-term loan with them. And basically we're just renegotiating the loan now. We're hoping to get actual inside tours of the Catalina, but to tell you the truth, I don't think they're going to let us. And I came to the museum in 2008 as a volunteer. I was working in maintenance. I retired, need something to do as you usually do. And it basically was an ideal job for me. I loved coming to the museum 2 days a week, hanging out with the guys, doing a bit of work, fixing the museum up, and that's when I fell in love with the museum, just absolutely fell in love with it. And so the curator at the time, she was leaving. She came in one day and said, "John, would you like to run the museum?" I won the lotto. And so I said, "Sure, no worries, when do I start?" And it was like, "Well, come in Monday." So I came in Monday and I said, "Where's the curator?" "Oh, she's gone." "What do you mean she's gone?" "Oh, she left." I said, "I'm supposed to be running the museum. I don't even know how to open the till." And so, anyway, so there was a bit of a steep learning curve, but it was, again, a labor of love. One of the first things I did when I came to the museum is I looked around at safety issues. Coming from a business background and knowing that safety has always got to be paramount in any business, that safety was the one to look for first. Notice on the left, we have what we call trip hazards. See a little wooden stand on the ground that's about that high off the ground. Very dangerous. In fact, we had a lady that actually, just about a week before I started as manager, fell and broke her arm. 85-year-old woman broke her arm, went in the hospital. It got infected. She had to stay. She slipped and fell in the hospital, broke her hip. Oh, it wasn't good. Wasn't good. And so those were the first things I had ripped out. I had the workshop come through and tear them all out, and we rebuilt them. We actually repurposed them. You can see the stand here. That's actually one of those repurposed wooden trip hazards into posts, and then put a nylon rope around. And we've had almost no problem with ingress from people coming through. They see that rope, they know what it is, they stay behind it. You know, you can push it right over, and it makes it so that people don't trip over it. We also started on a campaign of cleaning up the museum, because the museum was dead dirty. I mean, it was terrible. Since Adelaide left, nobody had done, pretty much anything. It had just basically languished. So the first thing order today was to fix the safety issues, and next was to clean it up. I got a call one day from a guy out at the airport. He says, "I got a window." I says, "I'm Mark. I work at the airport. We throw stuff away for the airport. I got this window I think you want." I said, "A window? Why would I want a window?" "So it's got a picture of an airplane on it." "Oh, that's nice. Send me a photograph. Email me a photograph, and I'll have a look." Well, he emailed me the photograph, and of course that's what came up on my screen. And I almost broke my arm grabbing for the phone, calling him back, saying, I will be there in 20 minutes. He says, but it takes half hour to get here from Bullcreek. I said, no, it doesn't. I'll be there in 20 minutes. And I got there, and I called up one of the other volunteers who held a glass business. He showed up there with the truck to put it on, and away we went. And this was a beautiful thing. You can see it now in the museum. It actually was at the Perth airport in one of their clubs, and it's a basically a representation of Briggs's flight from Sydney to Perth, the first flight in 1920, and is an absolute gorgeous thing. It's an old gyroframe. That picture really doesn't do it justice. It's actually about 2 meters by about a little over a meter, so it's quite large, and it's very beautiful. And you don't see it much from the outside, but of course, how these things work. It looks really good inside the museum. We started doing a bit of rearranging. One of the things we had to do was put up the rocket again. So we put the rocket launcher back up in 2011. There's some volunteers there. That's just a replica, tin rocket, as it were. It's not even an original in any way, shape, or form. The rocket launcher is original. It was actually from Lanceland, 1974. They had 2 of them up there that they had shipped from America. Can you imagine 4 tons of U.S. steel shipped from America, 2 of them, to launch 2 missiles to take pictures of the eclipse. One of the cameras was out of focus. The other one they never found. But it was a lot of fun. They didn't have any new use for the rocket launchers anymore, so they gave one to UWA and one to us, and we basically, again, mounted it there. And it's actually was located up closer to the south wing at one time. But after we built our workshop, it needed to be moved, and now we put it there. And we actually move it. It actually moves up and down. Guys wanted to say, can we get this thing to lift and rotate? And yeah, go for it. So they basically made it all rotate, and every Saturday when we run the engines, they move this thing up and down and rotate it a bit, and just to exercise it. In 2012, I decided, gee, we need to fix these floors. They looked really bad with all the paint peeling and everything. It was a constant nightmare, and the painters were going nuts. So they were getting a bit long in the tooth, and so I felt sorry. I said, guys, you can't be painting these floors anymore. So what we'll do is we'll put artificial grass down. We'll see how that goes. So I bought some artificial grass, the best stuff that looks as much like grass as possible, and we put it down. And it's been an absolute joy. It basically is 0 maintenance. In fact, if it gets dirty, it looks more original, more real. And so no maintenance. It reduces noise in the museum because the little grass, it reduces the noise when the kids come in, so that worked out well. And it just looks good. It looks right to have grass underneath plantings that land on grass. And we've now expanded that throughout the rest of the museum. And it's been a real good thing for the museum. We redid in 2013 the WAF display. As you can see here, this is a carbon copy of the one that was up in the south wing. The brief for my people for my volunteers that did this, I said, you guys, I want exactly what's up in the south wing, except I want just a little bit better. And so that's what they did. They brought it down, they did exactly what was up in the south wing. It looks almost exact. Do extra lights, make it look more professional, and put a ceiling on it to keep the dust out. All good. In 2012, I actually started looking at what we were going to do with this space. It used to be what I call the grassy knoll. I had the heron and the rocket launcher on at that time, and I said, you better do something. So I went on Google Earth and I looked down at the museum using the maps, and I said, oh, that looks about the right size for a Huey. So I went to the museum the next day and I said, okay guys, we're going to put a Huey here. They went, what? Where are we going to get a Huey? I said, I don't know. We'll find them. And so they set about building the display. In fact, they built the display with the faith that we were actually going to get one. It was sort of, build it'll come type thing. So they put in the tiles and they did the sandbags and the painting behind there, and it's all Vietnam indigenous plants and everything. And then about 2013, we found that the ADF was getting rid of some Hueys. Ooh, all good. And so it all happened. We bought a Huey and brought it in, away you go. We're having a bit of a problem at the moment. The camouflage you see on the top, it's not going to happen. We've been, for 2 years, 3 years now, we've been trying to put camouflage over the top of this, and there's some real issues. First of all, you can't buy good camouflage anymore. Nobody sells good camouflage. It's all rubbish. Stuff from China lasts about 2 weeks. And so consequently, this particular one's lasted almost 2 years, which was a big thing. $3,000 out of America. We got a cover for it. But the problem with it is that you can see by the light on the actual Huey, it only covers about 40% of the actual Huey. So in other words, you're sitting at about 60% of the light coming through, which is damaging the Huey. The Huey paint is really getting faded, and we will need to restore this in the next couple of years. Also, we're going to see damage to the perspex and to rubber and everything else. And of course, it doesn't hold out any water, and so it's just not working. And so we're going to have to put a new cover on. I got a quote today for $18,000, and consequently, we're going to have to put, and that's for a solid cover. Basically, it's a metal framework with just a carport. So if you're interested in donating some money to the museum, and you like to donate to somebody who uses 100% of your money, that is us. So but it's going to have to be done. So we're going to have to get it from somewhere. This shows the Weirway, which was restored, and this shows it in 2016. It was actually restored about 2010, 2009 by the workshop guys. They restored it in situ, right where it sits, complete with painting, believe it or not, and everything else. That was before the artificial grass. And as you can see, the floors, and you can see the posts with the ropes, it's all good. It's come up really, really well. There's the tiger moth, north wing again, same deal. And of course, you got to have art grass underneath the tiger moth. It's sort of law, It's what they did. And so it's come up again as a full-size diorama with the guy and the tools. And notice the flooring too. We've gone through and actually put in tile flooring, replicated the runway with actual vinyl tiles. That shows another one with the tiles, all really nice and clean. We have actually Centerlink work for the Dole volunteers. They come in and they do a great job. We've got 10 of them in the museum. About half of them do cleaning for us. They do a wonderful job. They come through and they mop floors and they dust, and they love volunteering in the museum, and a lot of them actually stay over after their work for the Dole time is done. Very popular place to volunteer. We have to turn people away, actually, for Centerlink volunteers. We're looking for volunteers in other places, but for the simple things like cleaning and stuff, we're pretty well right. You can see here's another picture. We got the runway, of course the Lancaster bomber as it sits today. We're actually going to be in this little empty spot here. We hate an empty spot in the museum. There's an empty spot. We're going to fill it with something. By the way, most museums have about 80% of their stuff in storage, and about, if they're lucky, 20% on display. We're actually the other way around. About 80% of what we have is actually on display, with very little in storage. I reckon around 15 to 20% tops. Most of that's books. So we have the spot here, and in a couple months you're going to be able to see a absolute replica bouncing bomb from the Dam Busters. The local company's making it. We're making it to the German plans with bouncing bomb. Now, of course, the British threw away their plans, as they do. Yeah, the Germans actually recovered bouncing bomb and did a complete plans of it, reverse engineer it. We're using those plans. So that's going to look really good sitting there underneath the Lancaster. Now here's a picture of of some of the volunteers. Again, that's Don Crane and Steve Waterhouse. And they're basically in the process now of restoring, this is Jimmy Woods' Anson, the Islander. And this Islander, of course, is an absolute gem for our museum. We only have, of course, unfortunately, the cockpit, but there you go. And so it's in the process. It's completely stripped now. They're not doing it here. They're actually moved it underneath the Anson. We're going to have to get a crane in to lift it out over the Anson. This is going to be fun once it's restored. But these guys do a Thursday and Saturday restorations, and they're basically, it's just absolutely wonderful. If you're really into and you want to help restore aircraft, we do have a need for 1 or 2 people to help with restoring the actual aircraft, if you have those skills. These guys know how to recover fabric on these aircraft, because again, you can see the sides here. That's actually all fabric that goes on there. And they've got it all stripped down and starting the process. They just finished the Proctor, and they'll probably be doing this for about the next, I'd say 2.5 years, maybe 3 years. We live on museum time, and this was a little bit hard for me to get used to, going from business into museum. There's one of the big differences is that, in business you're there 5 days a week. Everybody's there 5 days a week. You do your job. It's easy to plan. You can get things done pretty straightforward straight away. In the museum, people come in 1 day a week, and only for 6 hours, and they take lunch. and a break. And, you know, 2 breaks sometimes. And so it's a bit slower. And so you have to be a bit more casual. And that's okay, I can live with that. I'm fine with it. They do a great job. And to tell you the truth, there's no rush. If it takes 2 years or 3 years to do this, it won't make any difference to anybody really at the end of the day. I mean, and the thing is, they're going to do it right. They're going to take their time and do everything right on it. So I'm okay with that. Now I tell you, there is some downsides working in the museum. One, you'll have a lot of fun. So if you're not having a lot of fun, don't come. Second of all, it's very satisfying to see your work actually done, see something really, to accomplish something. It is a commitment. We do usually require people to spend at least 1 day a week in the museum. We're looking for guides. So if you feel like just chatting with people and telling them about, you know, old planes and stuff, even if you don't know everything about every plane, that doesn't matter. I don't. Although we're looking at possibly starting a men's shed. If anybody wants to get involved in starting a men's shed, we're interested in that. Our workshop is only used 1.5 days a week. And so therefore we have a full metal workshop, and I mean a full metal workshop available. What we would like to do is start a metal men's shed, working on metal stuff. Our team leader, Malcolm Sweetman, who does the workshop, is more than happy to help. And of course, we have all the tools and all the stuff already, so it's really more or less just a matter of starting one up. It's a wonderful place to volunteer. Thank you very much.
Yeah.